Welcome everyone to the weekly live stream of Committee for Workers International. Today we are going to talk about the crisis, massive crisis that opened up in America, carrying on. As you know, those who watch the news would know that corona crisis is still not over, and it is a very, very highest rate of infection in the US at the moment, and in Latin America also devastated by this particular crisis. Today, in order to talk about various things, we are invited two leading activists from the US and Chile, Jeff Booth from the Independent Socialist group in the US, and Patricio Guzmán. He's not the famous director of the Battle for Chile, he's the famous activist in Chile. Patricio Guzmán from Socialismo, Revolucionario in Chile, and also Tony Saunois from the International Secretariat to talk about the situation on the ground. First, let me bring in, without delay, Jeff Booth from the US. Jeff, can you explain to us, because the US actually is the world leader in terms of the rate of infection and death, and can you explain the situation that is there on the ground in the US? As also explain, can you, if you can, a little bit about the impact it has on economically on the working class?
Well, the situation, as you can probably tell from the corporate media internationally in the US, is really volatile in a lot of ways. And if you read the business press, there's a lot of worry about the combination of the COVID virus spiking here in 40 plus states, especially California, Texas, and Florida, some of the most populous, the biggest states by population. There's also the economic crisis worsening, and the relatively speaking, really high unemployment. Not uncommon to see either just in traveling or on the media, lines of people waiting for testing, lines of people waiting for food. I mean, you're not going to see this everywhere, but if you get around a bit in the cities and so on, it's a real crisis brewing here. And the way it impacts the working class is, for millions of workers, it's a sort of threat to work, on site somewhere, which has already happened to millions, the so-called essential workers here that have been forced to work even at the height of the pandemic or earlier spikes of the pandemic, and now that's being added to by the millions by workers that are now in different states being forced to go back to work. So it's sort of a work or risk death situation in many cases, or work or risk putting your family in jeopardy. And I personally know of a handful of workers, and this could be compounded, multiplied many times over, that quit their jobs out of fear of infecting family members. And then in the United States, when you quit your job, you don't get unemployment. And if you can prove that you were fired unjustly, which is very hard to do, and so on, there's a lot of hurdles to jump over, you may get unemployment, but unemployment is by state, unemployment payments. And so a lot of workers trying to get unemployment that needed it desperately had to wait a long time or didn't get it and still aren't getting it. So that's created a desperation situation. So they go to charity operations, usually by churches or sometimes by private food banks or homeless shelters, to get help because they're becoming homeless, they're looking for food. And then those places, because of the pandemic, because of the virus, are limiting capacity. So every way you turn as a working person now, it seems like something is wrong, there's some sort of threat. And I personally am facing that as well with my family. And do I go back to work or not? I'm in a union. I work in the very large workplace, Harvard University, probably the third largest employer in Massachusetts. And our union is not that strong, but as far as sort of the social pressure on Harvard, its public profile, a lot of workers are resisting going back to work when they want us to, myself included, until the situation really clears up more with the virus. And Massachusetts, by the way, is one of the states that has the lowest new rate of infections and one of the lowest rates of mortality. But if you follow the statistics, which are even in the corporate media every day, there's still deaths, there's still more cases, and there's no borders between the states here. So the states with huge numbers of cases, the people will travel across state boundaries, especially in the summertime, and you'll have a spike then in places that aren't expected. So Massachusetts, for example, where I am at, is in New England. A couple of New England states are having a spike in cases. So it's a really bad situation for working people. And the last thing I'll mention on this is that a lot of people, you might read in the media there, and it's certainly true among people I know, there are people that are trying to resist the full impact of the virus in a sort of, the mask wearing is really too tough. Shouldn't have to do that all the time. They're exaggerating the virus. There are people like that out there, working people included, but it's really mixed. It doesn't split down sort of some sort of political line, however you want to define that. It's basically if you've run into somebody in your family or your circle of friends who's been infected by the virus and been sickened by it. And there's still a certain number of people that hasn't happened to, so they can try to resist what's going on. But meanwhile, you were told to wait, for a vaccine. We're told to wait for testing. We're told to wait for safety, proper safety equipment, and so on. And we battle, like, again, back to my situation, which is fairly common, battling with the bosses and the employers about safety measures. They don't want to spend the money. They want to force us back to work, but they don't want to spend the money on making the workplace safe. They'll do cosmetic things, little things, but the bigger problems go unaddressed. Like where I work, they lock the windows. Can't open a window, can't get any fresh air. They say, well, we circulate the air. We don't know how much. We don't know when. That sort of thing. So it's very serious. I think more and more people are being impacted directly by the virus. It's a big country. There's a lot of people that might think they're escaping it somehow, but it hits home time and time again. And protests are sporadic throughout this against aspects of the virus. Of course, it's nothing compared to the Black Lives Matter movement that rises and ebbs. We can talk about that. So for working people, it's really, really tough right now in the U.S. Really, really precarious. To add, we used to use the word precarious prior to the COVID virus and the recession. Now, that meant like precarious jobs increasing and so on, like no future really to be seen. That's increased exponentially. A huge number of people just feel like, what is the future going to be like here for them and their children or people they know? And it's looking really bleak.
Thanks, Jeff. Quite graphically painted the picture in terms of what horrific conditions faced by the U.S. workers. This is the country, the leading economically developed country in the world. The conditions that Jeff earlier explained in terms of the working class condition is dire, and there is no hope of future for huge number of young people and workers. And in Latin America, in the Brazil, Chile, in the epicenter of this particular crisis as well, along with the US. In Brazil, for example, even President Bolsonaro reported to have tested positive for COVID-19. However, he's still arguing, need to keep the economy, and this is kind of almost like he's not shifted massively from the kind of view that he had that it's just another cold. Hence, one of the reasons the Brazil seen a huge number of deaths. They have not taken adequate steps. And in Chile, is also there is a higher rate of death per head. So, Patricio, Guzmán, if you can share some with us in terms of what's happening there on the ground, the conditions that is faced in terms of the health crisis and the economic crisis, and how it's impacting on already deprived communities and workers in the country. Patricio?
Well, the corona here is very, very hard. In fact, we are per capita, according with our population, we are the worst country in the Americas. We have the most number of dead people and the most number of sick people. Relatively, of course, we have only 18 million people living here. But the economic situation, I think it's worse. Here, authorities have been taking some steps. Very confusing. Sometimes they say something, but mostly of the population of the country now is closed. We cannot go freely to the streets. But this is combined with with a country with no social security. I think in some ways similar to the US, but in a lot poorer country. So we now have 30% of unemployment, and most of the people is not receiving money. It's a desperate situation. And it has opened way to a political crisis. First, because sporadically they are protesting again, but in parliament, something unexpected happened. A bill to give back 10% of the private social security funds to the people. There's not social security, of course, it's a compulsory saves, is opening its way because some of the right-wing congressmen has been voting in favor of the measure. So government, and of course the big corporations and the companies, mostly Americans, that own the system are desperate to stop it. But people saw it as immediately help in a very critical situation. Now, to exemplify it, all the country in the working class neighborhood is with common social community dining rooms. They are managed by the people themselves. The same leaders that were struggling before the pandemic in the streets, now they're in charge of feeding the people. It's not the state, not the churches, it's the people themselves, with the help of other people. People that own little shops, people that has a little more rights than the others. So that's the way thousands of families are eating. If not, we'll have a pandemic of hunger. In fact, there were protests moved by hunger. Now, we don't know how long it will still. The economic crisis here is deep, and government has no way out. The state has no way out. So, and I finish, if the bill is finally approved, to approve a law in Chile is a very long way in the Congress, but it is finally approved, the government can't stop it because we have a presidential system and they have different ways to say, no, it's approved, but it will not be a law. People, some trade unions, and a lot of neighbors have announced that if this happens, we are going to the street immediately again. And the authorities themselves, a minister of the government, say that they know that if the bill is not approved, will enter in immediately national massive unrest. And what they are doing? Preparing the repression. They are buying a lot of a special instrument for repression, etc. They don't have a solution. That's our nasty situation.
Yeah, it is a heartbreaking situation. 30% unemployment there, Patricio pointed out, in terms of, he used the phrase pandemic of hunger that could emerge in a number of countries, in Chile as well. We should remember that before this particular crisis, there was a massive movement developing in Chile, challenging the government in terms of their policies, etc. Now, the people are forced to defend themselves, feed themselves, and organizing themselves to save their own lives. It comes to that, and then facing death by hunger. Such is the situation. Obviously, there is a sort of explosive movements could develop out of this. Of course, it's not just in Chile. Throughout the Latin America, there's various complications that are rising, turmoils and terrible conditions are emerging for working class. And I want to bring in Tony Snow from the International Secretariat. If you could, Tony, explain a little bit more about other countries. What is the situation in Latin America in general at the moment?
Well, I think, Sinan, you've got really two fundamental issues that we're faced with here in Latin America, which, as everybody's indicated, together with the United States, is now the epicenter of this crisis. It's in a catastrophic situation. But there's two main issues that I think are emerging. One is the depth of the health crisis, which is sweeping the entire continent. The other is what is unfolding economically, which is disastrous as far as the depth of the recession is concerned, and it's going to have international repercussions, as I'll explain in a moment. But I mean, I think it's important that we underline here what has happened with the scale of the infections and the deaths. Latin America accounts for approximately 8% of the total world population. In the last 3 to 4 weeks, it's accounted for more than 50% of the deaths from the coronavirus throughout the country. It's a disastrous situation, and it's quite interesting to contrast what has happened throughout the whole of the continent, as Patricio has indicated in relation to Chile, which is incredible, because it is, after all, allegedly one of the more developed of the Latin American countries. It's got one of the worst death rates now on the continent at this stage. But compare that to the position in Cuba, where you still have a legacy of the revolution. They have not had a single infection for more than 2 months. And that is a measure of the superiority of their healthcare system, which was a byproduct of the revolution that was carried through in Cuba, despite the steps that have been taken towards reintroducing some capitalist measures. And it's just incredible, the contrast between what has been done on that tiny island to the mass slaughter which is taking place in other countries which have much more resources and are more developed. And it's particularly the case, I think, if you look at the continent as a whole, the more neoliberal and right-wing populist governments, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Piñera in Chile, have had the worst results in terms of the position. And of course, that's been echoed in relation to Trump as well. So it's a disaster, and it's against the background, as Patricio emphasized, with almost a non-existent health care system throughout the vast majority of the continent. Now, that's on the one side. So we have a position of misery as far as the depth of the infections and the death rate from the coronavirus is concerned. But then you have this incredible economic situation, which is also opening up. And what we're seeing is horrific potential. I mean, Patricia gave the figure of 30% unemployment in Chile. Well, what really we're talking about is going back to a worse position that you've had since the 1930s. I mean, we're heading for a position in many of the Latin American countries now, which is going to be worse than the ravaged economic crisis that developed there in the 1980s. You have Mexico, for example, where they're anticipating the gross domestic product could plummet by more than 10.5%. That will put it as in the worst case scenario of any of the major emerging markets in the neo-colonial world. And of course, that's to be repeated elsewhere. Now, the other factor, which is very important, is the accumulation of debt, which is ravaged and accelerated. You've had in virtually every Latin American country an explosion of debt, partly as a product of the coronavirus, but it was there before, but it's been accumulating. Brazil, for example, will now have about 100% of its GDP. Its debt will be equivalent, to about 100% of its GDP. Now, I make that point because it is important, because you have the accumulation of debt in the advanced capitalist countries as well, but this is not the same in Latin America. The advanced capitalist countries can live for a temporary period with a substantial debt. Latin America is not in that position. Their creditors are not going to be able to tolerate it. And you're having the situation unfold where there is the imminence of a major debt crisis, which will probably be more serious than that which rocked the continent in the 1980s. Already Argentina has in effect defaulted. Ecuador is also doing that. They're trying to restructure the debt there. It is, as the Financial Times pointed out today, a ticking time bomb. And debt default throughout Latin America, if it develops, it's going to have profound repercussions in relation to the world economy itself. So leave aside, of course, the devastating consequences. Now, very briefly, the other point I think we have to draw out for some of our viewers is what is taking place in terms of the slaughter. Now, it's horrific what we've heard from Patricio, obviously in the United States. We saw the horrific reports of the United States of the killings of the triggered the Black Lives Matter movement. But Brazil, frankly, is unbelievable what is unfolding there. If you take what has taken place, in 2019, 6,000 black youth were shot dead by the Brazilian police. And that was 2019. According to recent figures, in the state of Rio de Janeiro, that has increased already this year by 43%.
Jeez.
Throughout the country, not just by the police, this involves drug trafficking and the gangs, etc. It is estimated there's probably about 24,000 black youth are shot and killed every single year as a result of violence. One black youth in Brazil is killed every 23 minutes. I mean, it's US is a devastating position, but what is in Brazil is in some ways even more devastating. And what we're seeing really is this is going to trigger a massive social explosion. Bolsonaro is in trouble, and I think it was very important the points that Patricio was making about how the community in Chile has begun to organize itself, to feed itself. The re-establishment, as he described there, of the olla comunes, the common pots which were thrown up under the dictatorship during the recession in 81, 82, 83 in Chile for the population to feed themselves, is being repeated. And on the backs of the mass movement that you spoke about is one of the most important things, because you are seeing in Mexico and also in Brazil similar trends of communities coming together, self-organizing. It's not the state, it's not the church, it's working people, the most poor and oppressed, are coming together to build their own embryonic small organizations to defend themselves and in this case to feed themselves. So I think we have an explosive position taking place throughout the whole of the continent at this stage.
The extremely important point you made there, Tony, in the end, but it's the picture that Tony gave in relation to the death and the killings that are taking place in Brazil is unbelievably breathtaking. And it's fear, even the bourgeois fear, so they call it culture war. Basically, the FT and the Washington Post, they're all writing an editorial fearing the culture war. And the social explosion is waiting, and simply put it, a ticking time bomb by Tony explained there in terms of what's happening in Latin America. Let me go back to the US a little bit more in terms of the political crisis that is also opened up in the US. Jeff, if you can explain a little bit more in terms of the unfolding, the political crisis in the US, what's the prospect for Trump? His rating beginning to decrease, but also what would be like if Joe Biden wins? What would be like a Biden presidency? Is there be any hope? Say like some of the Democrats would argue. And where is Sanders now? Where is in all these crises? Where is Sanders?
So there's there's about 15 weeks until the election, or approximately, and there's key things yet to happen that will determine what happens. Finally, of course, a lot can happen before then. The end of July, the end of this month, is actually a key moment, because that's when the unemployment subsidies, for those that manage to get it, a sort of top up of $600 a week, is going to, or perhaps it's a month, I have to double check that, but it's for a lot of people, given the how bad social benefits here in the U.S., that was that plus the first stimulus check, allowed some sort of survival. That's ending now, and some states and cities had eviction bans or moratoriums. Not all by any means, but some. So that ends in July. Most of those end in July as well. And in the Congress right now, the House has already passed a bill, stimulus aid package, similar to the previous one, which ends up giving more to the corporations than to the workers. But whatever the workers can get, we'll take, and run with it as far as we can. And but that is going to get watered down, it looks like. And that's coming up really soon. If that doesn't hit by the end of July, then you're going to see all the things we talked about earlier with a deepening recession really impact even further on the election situation. I mean, just really quick, 4.3 million people were not able to pay their mortgages in May, 30% in June, and of course, like for example, where I live, which is considered a state with low COVID rates, Massachusetts, relatively low COVID rates now, you had the highest unemployment in the country for 17.4% in the last month. And you had over 4.5 million file for first time unemployment in June. So I just opened to answer your question again with some economic statistics, because that is really on people's minds. That is the overriding thing. That plus COVID, of course, the pandemic. Now people are really sick of being semi-quarantined or being, like I mentioned earlier, forced to risk their lives or risk the health of their families or their own health with a threat of go back to work or starve, given the low level of social benefits in the US, or lose your home, become homeless, and so on. Homelessness is, of course, increasing. So as a result of all that, Trump is down 15% by most polls, most recent polls, and by many polls. It fluctuates, especially by state, but if you look at the entire country, it's down 15%. And right now, the majority, it's safe to say really right now, the majority of the ruling class, the majority of the capitalist class have decided, no, Trump we can't support him anymore. Trump did well for them in the first term, earlier in his term, but now they've calculated this is just not going to work for them. So you actually have more billionaires donating to the Biden campaign than you do the Trump campaign. And the corporate media, it's really open season on Trump. They're going after him. Even Fox News, a conservative news, relatively speaking, in the corporate media on Sunday, had a mocking interview, openly mocking Trump during the interview and questioning everything. I don't know how many people saw that, relatively speaking, but they repeated it in the corporate media news. So Trump is depressed, we've heard. He's definitely on the ropes. That's a good thing. Trump being depressed is very nice. But it's not, as we know, it's not just about Trump. It's about Trumpism. And unfortunately, Trumpism has leaked into the Biden, I'd say embraced really by the Biden campaign and by the Democratic Party in general, in the name of anything to get rid of Trump. So there is a, Democratic, what's the exact name here? It's Sanders-Biden Unity Committee. So if you're wondering where Sanders went to after he suspended his campaign and after he endorsed, or as he endorsed Biden, but even before that, his campaign staff was meeting with Biden's campaign staff for weeks before he spent his campaign. After that, he threw all in. Sanders doubled down on the strategy of changing the Democratic Party somehow from his point of view and fully embracing Biden. Now, one thing to give you an example of what that means, Sanders campaigned very prominently on Medicare for all. That's a phrase for universal health care, some sort of national health service here. It varies in terms of details and so on. But this was one of the main issues every worker probably would have heard something about that, whether they agreed with it or not. Most would agree with it, the polls show. And Biden has never expressed any interest in supporting that and does not support it. So Sanders drops that, talking about that in terms of the Biden campaign, in terms of the Democrats as a whole. I mean, he still would talk about it in a general speech, but, you could go down a whole laundry list of issues where the Biden campaign and the Democrats are just running against Trump as a personality, running against Trump as he's not fit for the office of the presidency. He's not fit to be commander-in-chief. All this rhetoric, anti-Trump rhetoric, which certainly gets an echo because Trump is widely hated. There are, of course, a couple states I've read polls of, Alaska, South Carolina, states where Trump is still ahead. This is rare right now. Trump is behind. But Biden is borrowing from Trump's playbook. I mean, I see Trump, as Patricio mentioned populism, or Tony mentioned populism. we have to understand Trump has a strong populist element to his rhetoric. So there's this new stimulus bill that I think I mentioned about to go through Congress. Maybe some form will probably go through. The end of July is sort of an important marking point for that. If it doesn't go through, big trouble in terms of social unrest. It seems likely more social unrest. And yet, if Trump is now campaigning that he wants a larger stimulus bill in terms of direct payments to most people from the government, it was around 1,200 with some, more for children if you have a family last time around. He wants more than that this time around. And all his rhetoric about saving jobs and so on, Biden is borrowing from that, but in a very negative way. For example, in climate change, the Democrats just released through the Biden campaign a large climate change thing from this Democratic Unity Committee. But according to people involved in the issue, it basically is an endorsement of business as usual. This is a quote: business as usual for the oil and gas industry. Most prominently, Trump has come out against cutting fracking at all, stopping fracking. And the Dakota pipeline victory, a lot of people on the left consider it a victory where the Dakota pipeline was frozen by a court and they couldn't continue pumping oil through it. That's a big issue here out in the West for the rights of indigenous people and just generally the repression that happened to them even before the Black Lives Matter movement got going. And the courts just reversed that. So as far as any details, so the pipeline continues. So as far as any details about progressive demands or anything from the Sanders campaign, it's largely lacking in the program, just not there for the most part, almost entirely gone from any kind of program Biden's putting forward, but no one really hears about the program. So Sanders is now, his profile is much, much lower than when he was running for president. He disappointed, of course, a lot of his supporters. Now, in the context of U.S. politics, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to search for, left or independent left or whatever alternatives at this national or local level where they exist. Like, for example, Howie Hawkins running for president with the Green Party doesn't necessarily mean they automatically go over there. The Green Party is on, 20. The Hawkins campaign so far has ballot access to 26 states, write-in in one state. There's 50 states. The corporate media gave the Green Party a tiny little bit of publicity when they had their their convention 2 weeks ago, and the Hawkins campaign primarily, and that's disappeared again. So that's a big uptick in general for that campaign, but in general, the working class as a whole and so on is faced with, Biden or Trump. There's very little enthusiasm for Biden, much hatred of Trump. The polling data, I think, is fairly accurate, but a lot could happen between now and the election, unfortunately, including populist maneuvers by Trump. One last point about Trump for now. He's doing a huge law and order push. And you may have started to read about this in other countries because federal police officers are being sent into different cities, most notably Portland, Oregon, with plans to send them into Chicago, Columbus, Ohio, and other places. These are federalized, militarized police forces from the Department of Homeland Security, from border protection, so-called. They're being sent in camouflage fatigue with helmets on, no name tags, using unmarked cars and snatch and grab maneuvers to take protesters off the streets. So Trump's law and order rhetoric is out there in the media. The media feeds into it. The corporate media feeds it because on that issue, they want to move people away from demands coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement on police defunding, on deep reforms against police brutality and police racism. And the response from the Democrats and Republicans alike, especially on the state level, is to water that down as much as possible. But the Black Lives Matter movement still continues sporadically here and there. And big in some cities, like, again, Portland, 50 straight days of protest, 50 plus straight days of protest. Now the repression coming down. The protests might be small, sometimes they're big. There was a mom's march in Portland the day before yesterday, I believe, and the police still attacked that. The moms were, like a mother's march to protect their youth, some of their youth getting arrested and the potential arrest of other youth, and the police still attacked that. So that makes Trump, of course, more unpopular among all sorts of people. But the alternative doesn't look very promising for a lot of people.
Thanks, Jeff Booth. Again, explained the crisis situation that is in the US. But going back to Latin America a little bit, because Patricio, when you explained, you talked about the dire health and economic conditions that exist in Chile. But prior to this crisis, there was a movement, massive mass movement developed. And Tony, when he was finishing earlier, was talking about potential social movements again to develop. And what's the situation now, if you can outline in relation to the social movements and the protests, etc., and so on, developing in Chile? Patricio?
Well, there are signs of protest. There have been always, but especially in the last time. And it's concentrated with this issue, we want our 10% back. For example, on last 15th, the dockers in all the country paralyzed their activities, demanding that the vote that is going to be next day in Parliament will pass the bill. It was a very important movement. Unfortunately, most of the trade unions have been taking a conservative look on that. They say they are preparing themselves to struggle if necessary, but in fact, they're not doing the necessary now. But at the same time, in the neighbors, in the territories, people has been coordinating protests, mostly protests, we call it rash protests, sounding protests, from inside the homes, but there have been nationally. So through the networks, without, and that's at the same time a problem, without a common leadership, people find the ways to coordinate their actions. As before, our main problem is we don't have a mass working class movement or party. We don't have a recognized leadership. In fact, the former mass working parties that exist here, mainly the Socialist and the Communist Party, are in a very low prestige. And that's with all political parties. Before the pandemic, Congress has a 3% of positive opinions in polls, and government did a little better, but not much. So we are in a crisis of legitimacy of all kinds of institutions, but at the same time we lack our own. We lack our party, we lack a leadership of the movement. So I'm sure that the movement is going to explode, and quickly. But I'm not sure that we can resolve an exit to this crisis without a leadership, without a program.
So, Patricio explained there in terms of the potential that exists and anger that is mounting, and then held back by the corona crisis to an extent. However, lacking in terms of the leadership and the future, coming down to the question of leadership and the organization that we have to build in order to take it forward. But in relation to that, I wanted to bring in Tony to kind of, Tony has a very long time experience working in Latin America, and then written quite various articles explaining various processes, various events that unfolded in Latin America over the last decades. So Tony, can you give us a idea about what is happening now? What is unfolding throughout Latin America, and what is going to happen in the coming months and days generally in Americas?
Well, I think you have the prospects of massive movements taking place both in North America and of course throughout Central and South America as well. And in some countries those protests are there. And just to take up a point that I think Jeff raised, which is very important, is the question of populism, because you've had two varieties of right-wing populism reflected by Donald Trump in the most extreme form, And look at the consequences that has had for US capitalism. It's been a political catastrophe for the masses, for the working class in the US, but also for the ruling class. And they are at sixes and sevens in terms of how they're going to deal with this position because of the mess that Trump has plunged himself into. And it's a measure of how explosive the position you can be. And I mean, what Jeff described as taking place in Portland, I mean, we have to think about this. This is the main capitalist, imperialist country in the planet. You've had 50 days of continuous protests in Portland. They deploy, in effect, the military, or different branches of the military. It's quite a complex position, using methods that have been used in Latin America, unmarked cars, kidnapping protests, etc. And it's what we've warned about. Everything that US imperialism has deployed against the masses in Latin America, has deployed against the masses in Iraq, in the Middle East and everywhere else, they're now beginning to turn on their own people because of the fear of the social explosion which is coming. And as Jeff indicated, it is a tragedy, what is of a missed opportunity. Sanders has been criminal in terms of what he's done. Imagine had he split from the Democrats before, against the background of this crisis, the Black Lives Matter movement, he will be in a position of now leading a new left party, which will probably rally to its banner millions of workers, of young people, of all races and genders in the United States. And that opportunity was thrown away because of his insistence of trying to steer the movement into this capitalist democratic party itself. And unfortunately, the masses are going to pay a price for that. But the issue of a new party is there. And it's on the agenda de facto. It might be a bit obscured in the run-up to the election because of the thirst and the demand to get Trump out, but that can change very quickly. And it's just so explosive, the position in the US. It's almost unprecedented. That's maybe a term which is used a lot during the course of this crisis, but it definitely applies in relation to the US. And there's one point that Jeff didn't have time to touch on is Trump himself. I mean, if he's demoralized, very good. But there's all sorts of things could be ruled out. I don't know if our viewers saw the statement that he made when he was asked the direct question, would he accept the election result? And he wouldn't give a clear answer. And they have a blueprint laid out of how he could defy it. And in this land of the free, I mean, the electoral college is completely undemocratic. But apparently now it emerges that they don't even have to respect the popular vote in the states to elect the members of the Electoral College. The states themselves can appoint them. Well, if it goes to the Congress, you don't have all Congress, members of the Congress voting. Each state gets one vote. And he may use that mechanism to try and lodge himself in the White House. If he does that, I think it will open up a profound political crisis, and probably big sections of the US ruling class would move or are moving against him because they don't want it. But it's a measure of the crisis that you have there, with a section of the state machine around this populist Bonapartist element of Trump being out of control as far as as far as the masses are concerned, and as far even as the more far-sighted sections of the ruling class are concerned. But in Latin America, you have an equally explosive position, as Patricio has pointed out. And I think one point that I'm omitted to mention, when we talk about populism, we see right-wing populism, we've seen what Bolsonaro's done, what Piñera has done, but we've also seen the betrayal of another populist force, and that was Obrador, Lopez, Almo, as he was dubbed, in Mexico. He was elected as a radical populist. And the policy that he's fundamentally introduced has been no different to Bolsonaro or Trump in terms of opening up to the economy. He's capitulated to US imperialism and has just not offered anything as far as the Mexican masses are concerned. And you have a big crisis there. And as Patricio indicated, throughout the whole continent, or two continents, three continents, you really have a crisis of legitimacy of all of the ruling institutions and the parties against the background of this unprecedented economic crisis and the absence of genuine mass parties of the working class. And that is the big task that we have to look towards resolving as this crisis unfolds. Steps, in my view, are being taken, as Patricio has indicated for workers, for people in the neighborhoods especially, which is particularly important in Latin America, to come together in self-defense groups, organized committees, assemblies, to try and take whatever steps they can. And we have to intervene in that to raise a program to try and unify those movements. But the issue of building a new mass alternative workers' party is posed in all of the countries really at this particular stage. Has been a crucial necessity that will be equipped with a socialist program. And such is the explosion, such is the searching for ideas, that even relatively small Marxist and revolutionary groups with a bold program, clear proposals for organization and for the policies that are necessary can intervene in these processes, shape them maybe to a certain extent, but can certainly get a big echo. And as we've seen historically, even small forces can be transformed into relatively large organizations and large parties in a relatively short space of time. We only had to look at the history of the Chinese Communist Party, which was founded by 12 students, and within a matter of a few years become an organization of tens of thousands because of the revolutionary crisis that opened up. Whether that's repeated, we have to see, but an element of that is definitely going to be posed throughout the Americas in the course of the next period as this explosive situation matures and continues, and it will pose the urgent necessity for the building of a real socialist alternative.
Thanks, Tony. It's outlined the urgent necessity at the moment, the main need of the particular period in terms of establishing socialist organization, mass workers organization, to protect and defend and also go on the offensive, winning our rights and changing this maniac profit motive capitalist system and go through. And thanks a lot, and the comrades we were involved in this work in the US, Jeff Booth, thanks for joining with us today to share this explanation in terms of that normally we don't get in bourgeois medias. And Patricio from Chile, thanks a lot. And those who are watching this particular stream, please do like our Facebook page, which is Socialist World-CWI. And also there is a Facebook page for Chile, an organization, Socialismo Revolucionario, and also Independent Socialist Group. You can also go there and see our links and activities, etc. But also follow us on Twitter and on CWI Socialist. But you can also go to Instagram, Socialist World, and also, most importantly, please do subscribe to the YouTube channel CWI Media. And then if you want to read more of our analysis and then follow us in terms of what we do, etc., go to socialistworld.net. But also you can become a supporter. Contact us in terms of how you can get involved wherever you are. Join us in this particular important fight that is opening up, and contact us, keep in touch, and also please follow this particular live stream that we bring you every week with the activists who are working on the ground, which will give you a graphic picture that like you saw today, which is different to whatever you will see anywhere on the social media or bourgeois media. So please do follow us, and we will inform you if there is any change to this particular time period where we do this